So welcome to 10.5 years of Karachi and LaJamia times Fiza Khatri. I'm really, really excited to have you guys back. First had our conversation in September, and it was very clear that it was an unfinished conversation. So it's really, really lovely to kind of have you guys back to ask questions and answer questions of each other. And now Fiza is kind of a subject of questions too. So the lens is on you, as well as on Zara and Shahana. So before I'm gonna just do a quick line on each party. So starting with Fiza. Fiza was born and grew up in Karachi, Pakistan. They're an artist who lives and works in New Haven in the US. And then Zara and Shahana are two parts of an artist collective called Karachi LaJamia, which was founded in 2015. And Zara is based in the Netherlands, and Shahana is based in Canada. So everyone is joining from everywhere. But you're not really here to hear from me, so I'm gonna hand over to Fiza, Zara, and Shahana to have the space. I may ask some questions, but it's more about you're all here to listen to them. So over to you guys.
Thank you, Mala. Thank you for having us back. It's again really special to continue this conversation with Zara and Shahana. We also are realizing that, you know, the more we talk, the more there is to talk about. And so it's really nice to be able to have a part two where we get to deepen some of the points that were brought up last time and yeah, just dive a little bit deeper into our questions and practices and where we're all at kind of in this moment. Um, so thank you, Mala, thank you, Noor, thank you, Kuhu, Isab, for hosting us again. Um, so I guess we'll just sort of pick up where we left off a little bit last time. Towards the end of part one, we were talking about the map form. And Zara and Shahana, you had a really beautiful articulation around your journey with the map as a visual form, where it began with sort of a lot of critique of the map as this like abstraction that really erases and is used by the state to like weaponize representations of the land as Banjar, Ghairabad, Ghair Mahfuz, barren, uninhabited, insecure in particular. And then how that narrative is kind of used to dispossess communities um, and remove people from their indigenous lands that they've been cultivating for years. And then you kind of ended with sort of redeeming the map form because it also became this gesture of care and hospitality as you experienced it with your collaborators as you were traveling. People would make maps for you in your notebooks, and it felt like it was coming from a place of love, a place of remembering. You called it an invocation. Um, I'm really interested personally in kind of us thinking through like visuality a little bit more as a site of struggle. Shahana, you said in the last talk really well. You said that the struggle is not just about protecting the land, but the struggle is also at the level of the image. And you guys continue to kind of insist, I think across like multiple talks and projects. Zara, you've said like, you know, the map becomes a reality. In Wild Thought, there's this sort of story of Akram Jokio, whose land is being surveyed by government surveyors for dispossession and the construction of Education City, which you write about. And when the surveyors kind of arrive and look at his land and then send him back a map representing his land, it's the map is missing 5,000 trees that him and his family have been kind of cultivating and taking care of forever. And so you say in the essay, the erasure of 5,000 trees from the surface of the map is prophetic of the disappearance of 5,000 trees from the surface of the land. So this way that representation, and especially sort of, you know, as an abstraction that erases certain things about what's materially present, then goes on to also have material consequences for the people who live on that land. And so I would love to just talk about that a little bit more, you know, like how visuality becomes a site of struggle, how you understand that in your work, how you sort of experienced that in other projects or through other forms as well, or even just like thinking more deeply through the map form, if that feels, if it feels like there's more there.
Zara, you start.
Yeah, thank you for starting with that. I think that's a really interesting place to begin because I think Shahana and I, our collaboration of course, predates Karachi LaJamia, and it really came over these questions that we had about maps. And yeah, I want to be a little wary of not repeating things that came up in the last talk, but I think it might be a little inevitable, so I'm just going to go for it. Um, but Shahana and I started working together in 2013, and the first project that we did together was Exhausted Geographies, which was a compilation of 7 maps and 7 essays that we produced with an interdisciplinary group of artists, academics, and activists. And at the time, we were really interested in the ways in which Karachi was very much in 2013 being cast as this really dangerous city with violence, kind of the potential of violence lurking at every corner. And there was one contribution to exhausted geographies that ended up really influencing how we move forward in our practice and has been coming up again and again as a reference to us in the years since. And that was Nausheen Anwar's essay in the first exhausted geographies, in which the essay is about counter mapping and kind of looks at different essays, different instances of mapping and counter mapping in Karachi. Um, but one of the maps that she studies in that essay is a map that was produced by Dawn, the premier English language newspaper in Pakistan. Dawn's newly founded GIS department in 2013 had produced a map that was uh, casting certain neighborhoods in Karachi as no-go zones or red zones. And Nausheen Anwar, in her essay, writes about the ways in which that map functioned to create consensus and support for the militarization of Karachi and the military operation that then took place in Karachi uh, began at the end of 2013. And so that particular essay is something that really stuck with us and that kind of informed the ways in which we were thinking about and looking at maps and thinking about representations of Karachi. Shans, you want to add to that? Take from there.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I guess that's kind of the beginnings of kind of naming who we started thinking about visuality with. Um, but also, I guess soon after, when we were organizing the second course that Karachi La Jamia did, which was Gadab Sessions, and it was the idea of the course was in collaboration with the Sindh Indigenous Rights Alliance, who had just formed recently at that time to fight against the occupation of lands that Beria Town was unleashing. And we sort of did an open call, got together a bunch of people, and we would go every week or every other week to visit communities, spend time with people, document, witness, understand what was happening in the peripheries of the city. And I really, really clearly remember that one of the first meetings that we had with one of the community elders who had been one of the few people resisting is that me and Zara had gone to introduce ourselves, and he hands us all of his land had just been occupied. Police vans and bulldozers had come and they'd built a wall taking over, I think, 49 out of 50 acres of his land against his will. And as soon as we sat down, he like took out this big stack of photographs and he was like, I don't even need to tell you, just look at this. And it was like really like hundreds of photos he'd taken, documenting the moment of occupation, documenting all of his trees, documenting everything that was, and then everything that gets destroyed. And he tells us that, it was really important. The police was pointing a gun to our heads. We couldn't do anything else, but we had to risk taking out a camera and we had to risk documenting this moment. Otherwise, Beria Town will have the whole world believe that nothing existed here. And so, yeah, I feel like this kind of our focus and our understanding and our turn towards visuality and thinking about the material consequences of representation has been really informed and really led
by communities who really are at the forefront and who really are so cognizant of this kind of the erasure that is happening at the level of the image.
Yeah. That so do some of these images make it to Off Struggle, which is the
Yes.
web archive? Maybe that we could talk about that for a bit too, because we touched upon it briefly in the last session, but yeah, it feels like a really important place where KLJ is also like thinking through the form of the image across like a range of strategies. And like we've talked a little bit about how there's like multiple like speaking voices, different kinds of narration. There's a poetic voice, there's more documentary kind of images, there's screenshots of messages that um, you're sharing with your collaborators, images of the land, images of development, this sort of way of engaging in storytelling around what's happening in Gadab, by Bahia Town, and sort of needing these different sort of forms of images and textual strategies in order to tell that story.
Yeah, so Off Struggle was a website that we created that kind of came out of the all the research and the work that we had done in Good Art Sessions. And so with Karachi LaJamia, the work is the courses and the work is the study that we put together. And that kind of experience and moment of study and facilitating those spaces and types of study. And then whether or not something, a work or writing or anything comes out of those courses is not is it depends on the moment. It's not part of what we set out to do as Karachi La Jamia. But in the case of Gadat Sessions, because that was a 6-month long course, there was just such a vast volume of research that we had accumulated over those 6 months. And those 6 months of that course was taking place on site in Gadab as this devastation was happening, as the destruction and the complete reorganization of that land by the state was happening, and by this private real estate development organization, Bahia Town. And so when Gadab sessions ended, I think a lot of us who were part of that course felt the need to do something to share the work and the research that we had accumulated, the documentation that we had accumulated in different ways outside of the group itself. And as we were thinking about ways in which to do that, we were also really aware that a lot of the work that we had done and the research that we had gathered was really sensitive in form, in terms of, yes, in terms of the question of security and safety of the people who we worked with, but also in terms of, just the way in which you tell a story and how, again, like as Shahana is saying, questions of representation are so crucial here. When you see the advertisements that these private real estate development companies put out for speculators and investors, they always have these panning drone shots of empty barren land, which of course is not what Gadap is at all. It's this kind of this long-lived, many generations of inhabitation and a really, really rich, vast landscape. And so, and so we had this really big body of research, and we wanted to think and really thoughtfully, mindfully, carefully share it. And so it took about 2 years for us of working with the material that we had before Off Struggle became something that we were ready to share. This website was kind of built incrementally, bit by bit, designed by Abira Kamran, a designer who we work with very often. And Off Struggle, when we're thinking, again, we were kind of coming back to the map form because the map had been really useful for us and the kind of traditional form of the map, as much as we are very critical of it, with its kind of top-down aerial view and its colonial history of border line making, its fetishes for precision and scale, et cetera, et cetera. As much as we were critical of it, we also still found it very useful as a tool to, as we were in Gadab, better understand the processes of occupation and erasure that were happening there. And yet, when the time came to think about ways to share, we really did not want to work with the map form itself. We wanted to rethink the map form. That's something we did together. And so we kept coming back to Pahavaro, which means, if you translate the word Pahavaro, it means those who struggle. Paha means struggle, Varo means Vale. And Pahavaro Jabal was a hill range around which all of life and settlement in Gadap had settled, because the hills, when it was monsoon season, when it rained, the hills formed these really beautiful waterways that would then create these fertile bits of land that people would then settle around. And so the kind of ecology of Pavaro is really what organized life in Gadap. And so we wanted to organize our website around that form as well, and in as a kind of a mirror, or as a kind of in devotion to that form. And so that's why the website was named Pahavaro. And then we were thinking about how we would kind of reflect that form. And we kept coming back to a text that we had gotten with one of the facilitators of many of the sessions, of Gadap sessions, who was a school teacher in Gadap, who had written for us a list of landmarks in Gadap. There was this really incredible, rich, enchanted ecology, landmark by landmark. It included kind of, enchanted sacred trees and sacred groves, but it also included, little bits of personal family history. It also included,
Ancestral wells.
ancestral wells, etc. And so we had this list, and so we wanted that was also something that we wanted to organize our map, our website around. But then one thing, Shahana, do you want to take it from here?
No, I think you continue. You're in the groove.
Okay. So then of course, in the 6 months that we were doing Gadap sessions, the landscape changed irrevocably. There was no trace of Pahavaro, the hill range. The land was flattened, right? And so we revisited every one of those sites where those landmarks used to be. And by the time we did this revisiting walk, we found that all of those places had kind of transformed this really enchanted ecology that was laid out in this text, had kind of transformed into that kind of global development aesthetic, anywhere housing enclave, the Bay type of aesthetic. And so we got footage of each of those locations, and then we kind of created a website around it, where we created this grid for each of these spaces, each of these locations, and then every moment in the grid then becomes an entry point into a different story. And with every different story that we encountered, or that we were told, or that felt important about Gadap, and then in that kind of, with every moment in the grid and with every landmark, me, Shahana, Abira, we were all kind of thinking about different modes and different practices of storytelling, and the different kinds of knowledge and ways of producing knowledge and ways of narrativizing that we came across and that we practiced in those 6 months, and kind of working with that multiplicity of gestures within the website.
And just to add that, what also really kind of drew us to the name Pavaro, and that's what the website gets named as well, translation of like to be of struggle, is when we asked people what they mean, what the word means, and they explained the meaning. We were also told by elders that this name actually came because their ancestors centuries ago witnessed Sassi passing through these mountains in search of Banu, and they saw as her feet bled as she was walking across the mountain, and they witnessed her suffering. And it is in this desire to witness and to remember the suffering that connects you to the land, that marks the land, that embeds within the land and builds our relationship with land, that they name this whole mountain Pavaro in the memory of Sassi's journey and love and suffering. And we thought that that was really, really a kind of really moving and beautiful way to think about land. And so as me and Zara, Bira, but also everyone in the Gadap sessions who studied with us, we were also constantly kind of rethinking our own relationship to the city and to land through these stories and through people's sharings. So it's kind of, yeah, it's on this kind of really personal level that constantly we were also learning, reorienting, it's really drastically expanding what we thought the city to be, and then thinking about how do we create a pedagogical and visual platform that can share this with other people.
Yeah, and also just kind of thinking about knowledge and thinking about like what is important to know about a place or what is important, what is kind of legitimate knowledge. And to have that story of Pavaro be connected to the story of Sasti also it makes perfect sense because in all these kind of old poetry of Sasti, um, it is always said that Sassi kind of encounters and she walks barefoot across this really rocky landscape, which is exactly what Godap's landscape is. This kind of these big rocky boulders, hills made of these big rocky boulders. And in all of these tellings, there's so many stories of Sassi kind of finding camaraderie in the rocks and the stones and kind of telling the story of her loss and her grief to the stones and the stones crying in kind of in witnessing her grief and being with her through that grief and through that loss and that landscape being animated and that encounter and that mutual encounter. And so it felt, yeah, that also felt like a of the many stories an important story to tell and important, yeah.
Yeah, and it speaks also to sort of the very embodied relationship with the land that sort of struggle uh, both sort of, in a way represents, but also that KLJ really kind of practices as a pedagogy, is like being with the land, being in the land, being in sort of spaces in these really embodied sort of collective ways, as opposed to like, if you think of the map as this like authoritarian or like authoritarian, but also like a uh, like a form or a way of knowing land that is authoritative and sort of claims a certain objectivity, a certain authority, a certain completeness and closure of knowledge, and then how the various so the grid in Off Struggle, which goes to these different vignettes and these different forms of storytelling and different ways of imaging the land and sounding the land. Also, there's a lot of audio in there. There's sort of storytelling at the level of text. And it's not just sort of like one form of like a documentary form of kind of knowing the land or what's happening on the land. It's also these personal lived stories. It's also the collective memory. It's also sort of the history of the land as it exists in memory, as it exists in people's like personal relationships to it, which is really, really beautiful. Um, I feel like I'm maybe this is a nice time to talk about sort of witnessing also as like a methodology um, that I think is really important to you guys, like how sort of what you're describing really beautifully as like sort of how Pavaro became named as sort of the elders witnessed us to be moving through the mountains, and then now there's this sort of like moment also through the Gadab sessions, for instance, of witnessing what's happening to the land, to the mountain itself, and that as a methodology and a practice that LaJamia is really interested in. Uh, you talk about this, Zara, in your essay, uh, Ubiquitous Wetness, in which you talk about the Hum Kalam. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit. But yeah, just like what does it mean to sort of be conducting these courses now in collaboration with these communities in spaces of like devastation and destruction, and being present to that, being witness to that, being, I think, asked also to be witness to that by some of the community members that you work with. I think you mentioned during the floods when you were traveling in Sindh, there were people who kind of told you, oh, no one's coming to witness us. And we like this desire for people to be witnessed, and that as a practice that also relates to sort of like, what we've talked about previously as like grief, and sort of being present to this moment of destruction as grief work, if you can talk about that.
Yeah, I think I mean, kind of going back to where we started with that kind of 2013 terror map, that cast certain neighborhoods in Karachi as no-go zones and red zones, and then kind of functions to then again, the map becomes a reality. It functions to create consensus around the militarizing and securitizing of those neighborhoods, and then creating checkpoints that don't allow people to then enter those neighborhoods. And Gadap was one of those neighborhoods, right? That in that map in 2013, it's called a no-go zone. And then that kind of, the Karachi operation functions, and the casting of that space as a no-go zone is really successful in then creating this obscuring what then goes on to happen in Gadap, having people turn away or creating these checkpoints so that the militarization and the dispossession of people there and the, encounters and all of that stuff can happen there with impunity. And so in that sense, when we were doing Gadap sessions, it felt really important to not abide by those maps, to not abide by those boundaries, to not abide by those checkpoints, and to kind of to be there. And that's where the kind of the site specificity with these courses also comes from. Shahana, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess kind of what Fiza was pointing to, Zara, like you've done some really kind of beautiful writing in the past year or two where yeah, just kind of in thinking about what are what is our responsibility in this world, and what are the ways that we what is the ethics of relation and the ethics of witnessing. And you talk about this term hum kalam that you come across in Pitcha, and maybe you can tell us a bit about that, the story of that.
Yeah, it was just a moment with Dr. Bisharat Lanjwani, who a lot of us know and are, very influenced by. And Dr. Bisharat Lanjwani is an academic, a scholar based in Jamshoro University. Uh, and he is also he is also a devotee at the shrine in Pitcha. And he is a ragi, so he is a practitioner of the rag in Pitcha. And so a lot of my research on the sonic histories of Sindh and Balochistan, conversations with Dr. Bisharat have really, really influenced how I've been thinking about all of that. And yeah, and that particular word hum kalam, it was in a conversation with Dr. Bisharat where I'd been talking about how we've talked a lot about what are our rituals and customs and traditions around playing music and performing music or reciting verse. We talk a lot about the rituals and the customs around that, but I was asking Dr. Bisharat, what are some of the rituals and customs that we should know around listening? What are some of the rituals and customs and traditions and obligations of the listener? And I really was struck in that moment and really moved by Dr. Bashar. I mean, Dr. Bashar said a lot in that moment that really moved me. But one of the things that I mentioned in that essay is his use of the word hum kalam, because he talks about how in that moment of recitation, uh, the reciter and their instrument are hum kalam, and even the musician is obviously always engaged in the act of listening. There's a mutual listening happening between the instrument and the vocalist as well. But also he then kind of goes on from there to say that also the listener is also hum kalam, because it is the listener's witnessing that brings the rag to life as well. And the presence of the listener and as witness is necessary for the rag to come to life. And the fact that he used that word ham kalam, which means kind of interlocutor or yeah, ham kalam is speech or discourse, but ham makes it collective. And that as a listener, you then become imbricated in the collectivity of that moment, of that kind of sacred moment. And then once you become imbricated in that collectivity, you also then have to abide by that. You also become imbricated in a set of obligations that you then have to abide by as witness, as someone who stepped into that sacred space. And I think, yeah, I think that's really important also in a lot of the work that we were doing in Karachi, LaJamia, and the courses that we were putting together, the sessions that we were facilitating. That idea that that you are being you're stepping into a space uh, that then invites you into a collectivity and and places upon you a set of obligations or a set of really beautiful invitations that you then must abide by, and that looks like action.
Mm.
Fiza, maybe this is a good time to turn to your practice as well as we're thinking about kind of Hum Kalam and listening to Zara is framing that. It made me think of
Yeah.
your Karyal series, for instance, or just
Mm.
the ways in which you are using painting, which is, this misconception of painting as this really solitary individual act, but constantly in your practice, you um, are thinking about painting in such expansive ways, and painting
Mm.
as ways for us to see differently, think differently, relate differently. So maybe you can speak a bit to us about that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I think a lot also about um witnessing in relation to my own practice as well. And I think particularly it comes up in the practice of painting from life, which in some ways is like the foundation of everything that I make in the studio, even if everything is not actually made from life. That tends to be where a lot of the sort of initial thinking or thinking through making really happens. um there's it's pretty simple for me, where it's really just about sharing presence with another and sort of translating that materially through the act of painting. So just sort of tending really deeply to my relationship with someone else, with a subject, with an environment, with wherever I am, whatever I am being attentive to, paying attention to. That feels like kind of in some ways the heart of the matter. And so that the Cardial series kind of came out of that, where I sort of was, just happened to be in the collection of the Peabody Museum at Yale with a friend, and just like looking at some specimens and sort of being totally just like compelled by the fact of these bodies that had become objects, and mostly just having a really hard time integrating that and integrating also the scale of it. Like when you walk into the collections, there's a way that they feel like a morgue, where there's just like shelves stacked with like jars and boxes and bottles and things with like bits and pieces of like animal bodies, like kind of stacked away in them. And they're really sort of the argument is, for the purpose of scientific study, and that has sort of its problematics anyway, but then it's also false in a way, because not most of these specimens are never even studied. They're kind of just like accumulated for the sake of having a collection. So anyway, it just sort of led me to want to engage differently or to relate differently to these what were once living beings, now constituted as sort of dead, but also suspended between life and death, kind of bodies in the collection of the museum, where they're kind of taken out of a life cycle. And so over the course of the project, which I kind of keep iterating in various configurations, and thinking through also like how the subject is related to in painting, in like the sort of the form and the frame of painting itself. have come to kind of like make paintings of them as they are in their current condition, but then also make paintings of them in imagined sort of otherwise, like living like worlds that where they can enact a different relationship to ecology and landscape. And so one uh, painting installation, this multi-panel installation in particular called Return to Water, was kind of this like fictive return for the Gharyals into an environment enacted through the site of Mangopir, which is a shrine in North Karachi that sort of houses Gharyal, or not Gharyals, Magarmach, crocodiles as sacred beings. And so it's also thinking through like how Mangopir relates to the non-human as sort of, you know, sacred ecosystem and ecology and part of the the life and the life world of the space itself as like living beings, as beings that are respected, that, you know, we don't need to know everything we can about them in order to like sort of have a relationship with them. Whereas at the museum, it's like they're studied and mined for information. And there's this sort of like obsession with learning more and more and more. And that also as like a knowledge system is like so you know, it's really reflected in these Western institutions, this like sort of desire to endlessly know more and more and more about a subject, and that as a practice that I'm also critical of. So yeah, like I think a lot of this work kind of thinks through really these relationships with bodies, with beings, with each other, with you know, who and what we consider a part of our ecosystem and why, and what the stakes of those relationships are, and how they could be constituted differently.
Mm. And this is really making me think then that it's kind of connecting the two things that we're talking about of like, yes, one part of representation that we, for instance, did in the Gadab sessions is to witness and represent what is unfolding before us, whether it's violence or histories of land or whatever it is. And then the other part of representation is kind of like what you're saying of
Yeah.
reenacting, imagining differently, or imagining a different future, or yeah, that kind of the part of representation that has to do with imagination and promise and survival. And I feel like, yeah, that came together really beautifully. And it's something I've been thinking so much
Mm.
about because the past few years I've been working with the communities of the Indus Delta who have been displaced from the Delta to Karachi because the Delta land is completely being violently and really drastically being submerged by sea. And as these communities are displaced, find their way to like these really concrete jungles of the city to informal settlements, either it's usually Ibrahim Hedri or Ririgod. I came across this kind of really interesting practice of these communities turning to painters who traditionally would paint boats and asking them to paint murals of their homelands that they've left behind. And often these are murals of their ancestral creeks, the river, their shrines, their villages. And again, that thing of the task of representation here is then not just to document reality, but
Mhm.
also make a different reality possible or make a different kind of return or repair or recovery possible.
Yeah, totally. I so resonate with that. I think because for me, and sort of what we were talking about earlier, right? Like the material consequences of images. Like there's also something about the reverse of that, where it's like there are certain forms of repair and return that are perhaps not possible materially at this moment in time, but they can be enacted at the level of the image, right? Like, and it's almost like we, like I think we kind of need that, like there is, you know, it's like if the state is creating a certain imaginary, and these like oppressive structures and institutions are creating their own imaginaries via the image as well, it's like we also need to create sort of alternatives to that, or um yeah, you know, like images ultimately are like I don't know, they're like apparitions or something, but it's almost like we need them in order to see differently. And I think Zara, you talk about this too, right? Like sort of the invoking also via text and via sound, but also via the image, like sort of and that act of invoking itself kind of being something that um feels like or looks like resistance or dissent against like hegemonic, oppressive knowledge systems.
Yeah, but also in like what Shahana is saying, and yeah, and the Ghayal work as well, also kind of thinking against thinking against this really European idea of image making as a secular practice, as opposed to thinking of image making as a sacred obligation to remember, to invoke, as a practice of zikr, right? And I think that's just like it's such a starkly different way of imagining. And so many of the kind of anxieties over the problems of representation that come up in critical theory and in European thought are so premised on the secularization of this act of image making.
Wait, Shahana, can you share more about, because I know we've talked about this a little bit, where sort of kind of related to what Zara was just saying, what you were sharing earlier about the paintings of the Indus Delta shrines, where you're seeing this very different relationship to painting, both how paintings are made, but then also how they're related to as objects. In people's lives, where they're not sort of like, these sanitized, like sort of secularized like art objects that one sort of looks at and only at the level of like aesthetics or something, like they become a part of people's lives in these really incredible ways. Could you share more about that?
Yeah, of course. It's I guess for to just give a very short backtext to this is before I came across the murals, I was also traveling a lot in the Delta with this one activist, Nawaz Dablo, and his family, who have been displaced from the Mal Creek in the Indus Delta in the 1970s. So that the displacement is this really long, ongoing thing that's been happening. And as we were traveling, came across the only structures that were still remaining in these vast, vast islands and across seas were shrines of saints in the Indus Delta, and everything else is gone. So villages, marketplaces, graveyards, everything that people had been describing, the abundance and fertility, all has been snatched away. And the only structures we would keep coming across are the shrines, and there are all of these really incredible stories of miracles of like the power of the saint that is protecting the shrine, that is still protecting fisher folk, that's making life inhabitable and possible. And so I initially went to these spaces and, I had my camera or phone and was meeting people. And the work kind of was really, everyone just was speaking about these shrines, even though I had not intended on I didn't know of the existence even. And in the early years of research, I was really paralyzed by this question of what is the right way to document these really sacred spaces? Like the camera and just kind of making a video, putting it out there just felt like um, that these are such I'm trying to think of the right word for it. But it just felt like the wrong thing to do, to be unveiling these spaces to a quote unquote global audience in ways that felt not respectful of the spaces that I was witnessing, and the kind of devotion and relationships that people had to these spaces. And so for a long while, I'm just like sitting on all this footage and all this data and just kind of, yeah, being unable to make anything of it. And then I came across these murals in these neighborhoods, and immediately it was just the most beautiful and the most alive animate representation of a landscape that I've ever seen. And this mural, I think Zara's seen it as well. It's opposite Fatma Majid, who's an activist that we work with. It's opposite her place, and she first took me here. Um, and when I asked her who got this mural made, she connected me with a family who moved here in the 90s and from another creek in the Delta. And one of the first things they do is they get the local painter to build a landscape. And they explained to me that we needed to stay connected to our shrine and to our sacred worlds. And the painting becomes when material worlds are disappearing, painting is our portal. And yeah, again, this kind of what Zara is saying, both of this kind of secularization that we are, I guess, part of or in a world that it is a common thing, but also the individualization that these murals are just the most communal sites and surfaces in the neighborhood, right? And that in some ways they are also the teachers. They are these incredible pedagogical tools where children who've never been to the Delta, who have grown up in the city, are able to witness these landscapes, to learn from it, to connect to it. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think sort of I love what you said about like quote you, when material worlds are disappearing, painting is their portal. Like it becomes the way to sort of keep the memory alive, but also to keep the practice alive as well in a way. And I was thinking of the murals, and then I was also thinking of the paintings that people get made on the pieces of wood that then they take back into their homes and put on altars and sort of have this sort of like relationship of, you know, practice with, where they become sort of a way to keep that memory alive, also in their own families and in their own homes, and they become these sort of yeah, like ritual objects or something. I'm seeing Mala here, and I'm wondering if we're getting a time check.
Yeah, just giving I mean, people can start putting questions in the chat. I have some questions, but I'm happy for you guys to just keep going, and as soon as we get a question, we can start answering that, and I can kind of pose mine. But maybe we'd do 5 more minutes before I ask you a question.
Sure, that sounds good. Um, I guess what you were talking about, Shahana, like this sort of the individualization of the practice, like how does that play out in the context of Karachi LaJamia, sort of you know, this like collaboration that uh, has been ongoing for 10.5 years now, and uh, is sort of, you know, like you move through that in the world, and then you also have your individual practices. But how do you sort of experience sort of both the concerns of your own practice as being so deeply communal, being like how they're received in the way that you put your work out in the world, and then also just through the collaboration. And I guess just sort of, you know, there's something that comes up a lot for me because, like, you know, painting is laden with sort of the you know, mythology around like the hero's journey and like the individual artist making like, you know, the masterful like art object. And it's something that I'm so resistant to, and it can be difficult sometimes to kind of insist upon the relational, more collective concerns of the practice, especially in my form, which, you know, for a good reason, sort of has so much of that baggage in the European context. But then you're also offering us obviously like a totally different way of relating to painting that is communal. But yeah, I'm curious if we can reflect on that.
Zara, do you want to, or should I start? Okay. Um, yeah, I guess this is something that I mean, when me and Zara started working together, it was just the most intuitive thing that like we were just immediately drawn to each other. We were both really interested in similar questions. We were both really struggling at the time that we were starting our practices in Karachi of how kind of isolated things felt and how the isolated ways in which the art world was functioning, how depoliticized things were. Yeah, there was just so many things, and we like saw eye to eye on everything. And so it was just the most organic thing for us to start working together. And of course, from the beginning, there's always, and I guess back then, maybe, I feel now maybe collectives feel more kind of canonized and mainstreamed. And maybe they were back then also, but we were constantly kind of being confronted with these questions of like wanting to quantify,
Mm.
who does what, or kind of wanting to break apart the practice and return it to two individuals almost rather than seeing it as a collective. And I feel like even now that me and Zara, of course, also both have our individual practices, this kind of question that comes up of like, oh, but then how are your individual practices distinct? And they need to be separate from this one collective thing that you're doing. And I feel like for me and Zara, it's like there is no border and all of it is porous that, without our collective artists, we would not be the individuals we are. And without us, our practice would not be. And so it's so hard to think of these things as separate, but that yeah, we form and inform each other, and I feel like our words and ideas seep into each other's individual works also, and that thing of like again, uh ownership, like this kind of really jealous, guarded idea of like, this is my idea, or this is, or even I feel like even we were discussing this yesterday when we were speaking of like there is a way to do citations and a citational practice that um, allows for your community to be present with you. And that sometimes you don't even need to do the naming, you're using each other's words, and that is also its own practice. And I feel like me and Zara are always are always doing that. But maybe Zara, you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I also just want to say, like, when we started out in Karachi in like 2013, the kind of work that we were doing, it felt so necessary to do it together. It felt like the only way to do that kind of work was to do it collectively. And yeah, a lot of the kind of work that we were doing, again, not only is it, yeah, it's about collectivity, but it's also, we were going to places and doing things where it's kind of like power in numbers, right? And also like when you grow up in Pakistan and as a woman, you're kind of warned against public space. And again, the answer is power in numbers and things like that. And so I think, and before, yeah, when we were working together in Karachi LaJamia, it's also, we always talk about, in the span of one work, there's so many different constellations of collaboration that happen. And so I think that, yeah, and so there's always been that collaborative ethos because that is just the nature of the work. But also, yeah, there's also kind of this, there is no such thing as a solo practice. There is no such thing as an individual work. And I think, yeah, and I think that's not just me and Shahana and our collaborations, but our like larger communities in Karachi, whether that's like within, those of us who are all artists, but even writers and poets and activists, we're all thinking together and we're all all of our work is kind of full of these kind of leakages of all the ways in which we thought together and things that we said to each other that permeated each other's consciousness in different ways and ways you realize and ways you don't realize. And in some ways, like I feel like I might produce like something that is, that is objectified as like this kind of solo work or moves through the world as a solo work, and that might be have been even more marked by Shahana than a work that we are kind of circulating as a collaborative work. And so I think, and yeah, and I think that then there is something about art world infrastructures and systems that discourage that kind of make those forms of collaboration illegible or difficult to find vocabulary for. And I think, yeah, and I think for Shahana, like, yeah, we get this question a lot about like the boundaries between our collaborative and solo practice, which is premised again on the idea that there is such a thing as a solo practice and that there is such a thing as not thinking together. Um, and I think that yeah, what we often say is that the only response to that is to just kind of muddle that up a little bit more to make that even more confusing, to like lean in to the confusion of it.
Thank you, guys. I've got a quick question which I'd love to ask, and then there is a question in the chat which we can ask, and then probably it's a nice way to wrap up. I spent quite a lot of time thinking about Scilab and spending time with like reading it and thinking about it, and I was really, really drawn to your ideas of like ecstatic eco-pedagogies, the idea that a river finds a way. And then Fiza, when you were talking about the Kajal series and this idea of returning the Kajals to the water and this sacred ecosystem, I was really interested in how all three of you consider kind of like the politics and realities of water and ecology that we are experiencing, like kind of globally. I mean, obviously you're very rooted in your practice is rooted partly in Karachi, but obviously you're all situated in different places. And how do you think about these things, and how do you think it will affect your practice going forward?
Who wants to go first? I guess yeah, I can start. I mean, I guess the thing about water is water connects us wherever we are, you know. So in some ways, I guess we've all been kind of struggling with this idea of what being away from home and what that means. But ultimately, there are still so many ways in which we do stay connected, and there are so many ways of staying connected to the land, to the communities, to the people, but also everything that we carry in us. I'm actually reading this really beautiful book by this Indigenous Canadian author, Leanne Simpson, called Theory of Water. And yeah, just learning so much about kind of this water is home as well in some ways. But maybe I'll let you guys speak more.
Wait, I'm so sorry, but my internet was being tricky and I missed like the second half of that question. Could I get like a quick summary?
I guess really the ideas of like how water and the politics of water play so strongly in your practice and especially with Scilab, but also thinking about how that kind of plays into what Fizza's been working on in the Kajal works, and how you kind of relate to the ideas around water in different situations, being away, I mean, as Shahana really nicely said, but being away from home essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, growing up in Sindh, water is such a, like the cultural, political, social worlds of Sindh are so deeply um, informed by the River Sindhu and how much, and so like, what people always say that the political and social culture of Sindh is marked by two main struggles, the struggle for the language and the struggle for the water. And so, yeah, and I think also, of our generation to have grown up watching in real time before your eyes a river dry up, is, yeah, it's just the horrific devastation of that, but also then to know that this is a deeply sacred river. And, like in Shahana's practice, how this work that Shahana has been working on with these murals and how the water continues to come to life in through these practices. And that's so true also for like the sonic worlds that invoke the Sindhu. The river continues to come to life through these practices, and is kept alive through these practices. So yeah, so I think, yeah, in that sense, I feel, yeah, that water and the river and anti dam, the struggle against dam and water containment infrastructure is so deeply embedded in my consciousness. And I also think it is like a question that, yeah, that people have dealt with through time of how to continue to maintain a relationship with someone or or a river or a landscape that you love despite separation. In the Sufi tradition, the greatest kind of lesson in love is learned in separation. And so I think that it is something, it's a new world of relation to then be dealing with and not be daunted by.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add a little bit because I think, and sort of part of what Zara and Shahana were mentioning earlier too, like so many of our friends also work with water or around water or like in sites that, a lot of the shrines that we're kind of thinking through were, initially set up because there was a water body nearby. And so both that sacred relationship with the water, but also water as a life source, like water as a life giver. And I think we were all kind of deeply affected by the 2022 floods in Sindh and just sort of like the devastation that they wrought all along Sindh and like all over Pakistan. And so also like this destructive force of the water and how those kind of work, in tandem. And I think Selab syllabus kind of talks about like there are moments where that is articulated really beautifully. The water will find a way, like, that way will be destructive if it is not allowed to go along its natural path. How the river has to kind of empty out into the ocean. And that also speaks to like sort of anyway, I mean, so the way KLJ kind of speaks to like sort of the development politics around water and then Shahana's practice as well around the drying up of the Indus Delta. I think at Mangalpir, it's sort of I'm interested in water um, and what it offers as a knowledge system in particular, because there's a way that, like
I think your internet's glitching.
technical problems.
We're good.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Okay, we're
You're
back.
back.
Okay, sorry. My AirPods died. They don't live as long as they're supposed to. Um, so one conversation in particular I had with the custodians of the shrine around, so when you go to Mangalpir, the water is like really murky and green and like really opaque. And sort of I was asking them about that and why it's so opaque and how it's difficult to see through. Because the other thing is that you see the crocodiles in the water and sometimes you miss them because they feel so much like a part of the landscape. And I'm really interested in that, like how the water and the landscape kind of conspires with the inhabitants and they are like, effectively a part of each other and not separate from each other. But then also the murkiness of the water and how opaque it is. The way they understand it is that they call it parda. They say that this is the crocodile's parda and parda in like the divine sense of like the veil. Where like this is a hidden world, we don't have access to it. This is sort of the world of the crocodiles. We don't need access to it. We're not meant to know what happens under the water. We're not supposed to. And so again, sort of this form of relating to land and ecology and ecosystem and our place in it that sort of respects a certain degree of opacity and doesn't sort of, obsess over the constant unending yielding of information and mining for knowledge and extraction of knowledge from the landscape, but really like a respect for it, a reverence for it, a way of relating to it. With a respectful distance, I'm really interested in.
When Fiza, this reminds me that when Richard Burton, this like colonial officer who's going on this spy journey to map the Indus, he writes in his like travelogue when he reaches near Sakkar, he's hearing all these stories that fisher folk tell him of Khwaja Khizar and how the palla fish go to make a pilgrimage to the shrine upriver. And people keep telling him that It's believed that these fish, out of respect, don't turn their tails to the shrine and swim in backward motions towards the sea. And he like writes in his memoir, and he's like, the river is so murky and it's so silty that I can't see through it, and I'm unable to disprove this nonsense that people are talking about. So yeah, the river really does work as a whale, and the river calls on us to see in a really different dimension. But it also, what you were saying, and Zara, even what you were saying, made me think of one quick thing that I want to share is that in the Delta, some elders will also like how do they think about this kind of the sea submerging the land is, in like scientific studies and state discourse, the sea is the monster and the bad guy in the situation. But people will say that no, the sea is coming forward in search of its beloved because it's unable to meet with the river, and so it keeps coming forward to connect and to find that union. And so yeah, it just made me think of like what you were saying also, Zara, but so much of this is about love and separation and grief and navigating these really human emotions, but also universal emotions, I guess.
Thank you guys. That was really, really beautiful. And I think it's really nice how that murkiness of the river, both for the crocodiles and the paddlefish, kind of goes back to that idea of representation of visuality, working to either prove something that's there or kind of have an erasure. But then this like idea of the veil protecting that to prevent an erasure, which is really interesting. But there is a question I would like to flag from Iman Setta. He's asked quite
Hi, Iman.
so I'll read it quickly for the recording's sake, but I'm curious to hear how you would articulate the shift in your practice now that you're based in a place outside of Karachi. Is it another phase of working? For example, you were working through researching, and now it seems like you are working through a lot of material that has already been collected. Wondering if you agree with this difference or it's totally something different going on. I'm also interested in this different questions which come up when interacting with different communities, like activists in Karachi versus people working in institutions where your work is being presented these days. Whoever wants to take that. Lots of questions. At least you can read it again if you need to go back.
Yeah, I think yes, it is yeah, it is a case of now working with a body of work that has already been collected. And I think there was a real sense over the years that we really needed to get around to that. And the only way to get around to that was to have some kind of separation from Karachi and to have some of that distance. And yeah, it is a completely different experience of working. I think I'm kind of hesitant to reflect too much on it in a recorded Zoom conversation, because I think we're so deep in that experience right now that it's hard, but it's like the water that we are swimming in, so it's hard to reflect on it. It's something that's kind of unfolding. What the practice now looks like or will come to look like is something that we are working our way through. So I think, yeah, and so I think on one level, it's a really amazing thing to be able to look back at this body of work and now be able to process a lot of it into material that we can circulate. For example, when we were in Karachi, we would only be able to, like Karachi LaJamia's courses and sessions, as Iman knows, because Iman was a participant, had to be really small in scale. And so we always had this concern about how we would circulate the materials, the research beyond the small groups that we were working within. And so now to be able to have the opportunity to do that and to be able to create work in print that then circulates beyond those small groups that we worked in it's really great to be able to do that. And it's really amazing to look back at some of the research and the documentation and kind of find find things that you don't, again, when it's the water you're swimming in, you don't really see things, you miss a lot of things. And so it is yeah, it's a different mode of working. But I think it's a really interesting mode of working also. Then you also have to kind of mediate that distance somehow. And I think in mediating that distance, I'm also again in a really new way coming to appreciate and realize just how much of an expansive body of work and scholarship has been produced in Sindh around questions of land and water, and just how much there is to read and look at. And so, yeah, so I hope that answers part of the question. Shans, you want to add to that?
Maybe I'll add to the second part of the question. It's really funny that you're asking this, Iman, because yeah, it is both of these things, of course, are very much on top of our minds and is something that we're thinking a lot about. Um, Especially because when me and Zara were discussing this the other day, that when Karachi LaJamia starts, we are both teaching at universities in Pakistan, and part of this kind of the pedagogical critique and this desire to learn, study, research in different collective ways emerges from our own embeddedness within the institution. But now I guess both me and Zara have moved away from Pakistan, and currently neither of us are teaching either. And so our embeddedness and situatedness in this moment is very much within these art institutions. Um, and and yeah, it's that thing of what Zara was saying, that we are kind of, as we're coming into these spaces and as we're having experiences where we are producing work specifically for exhibitions and specifically for a more international audience. Um, it is a radically different world. Um, but yeah, I guess in some ways, some of the critiques stay the same, but some are new. And these are things that, yeah, I think we're still thinking through a little bit.
I think we probably don't have time for another question. But I think what you guys are talking about with the like way of relating to institutions really strikes back to what you spoke about in the first talk about a curator giving you, you'd be like, how do we present this research in an institutional space? And the curator saying, do make the institutional space work for you, essentially, which I think was really resonated with me.
Really, like how to rig the systems and work them to your advantage is constant work in progress.
Amazing. Well, I'm gonna, because it's late in South Asia and getting later in, I know you, Fiza and Shahana, you guys have your full day ahead of you now. But I'm gonna wrap this up and just say thank you so much to all three of you for really giving your time to do this talk again. Maybe one day we'll do a part three, who knows? And thank you so much to the audience for joining and really spending time with us this afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Zara, Shahana.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, Mara, Fiza, Zara. Bye.
Bye.